When Clarence Thomas let out that laugh, it wasn't simply a small reaction to a moment in the room, it was a dismissal, a gesture that spoke louder than words. The chuckle was timed perfectly to cut across Jasmine Crockett's sharp questioning, and for an instant, it appeared as if he had succeeded in turning her words into something trivial. In the hierarchy of the space, where power often rests more heavily with seniority and recognition, his laugh carried the weight of a judgment. Many in the room leaned into that reaction, quietly nodding as if the moment had been settled with humor rather than thought. But what none of them expected was how this dismissal would backfire, transforming the atmosphere into one that placed every eye, every ear, squarely on Crockett. The power of that moment was not in the laugh itself, but in what it represented. Clarence Thomas was not just a participant in the exchange, he was a figure whose presence had long been regarded as unshakable. To laugh at Crockett's skills was to reinforce the idea that her role, her voice, was not to be taken seriously. For others, that might have been enough to create hesitation, maybe even silence. But Crockett, in her stillness, allowed the sound of his laugh to echo longer than intended. She did not rush to respond immediately, and that pause forced everyone else to recognize the undertone of condescension in what they had just heard. Suddenly, the laughter wasn't just his, it belonged to everyone who had silently agreed with the sentiment, and that realization created a tension they had not anticipated. What made the dismissal so striking was the way Crockett flipped it. Instead of reacting with visible irritation, she used the very act of his laugh to turn the spotlight back on herself. She began to frame her response in a way that was measured, precise, and deeply aware of the implication that had just been made about her skills. Each sentence she spoke after that laugh carried an undertone of defiance, not loud or aggressive, but steady and unyielding. The more she spoke, the more it became clear that she wasn't just answering a question or defending a point. She was redefining the space in which Clarence Thomas had tried to contain her. His dismissal gave her the opening to show that she did not merely belong in the room, she could own it. Clarence Thomas, in that moment, unintentionally became the backdrop against which Crockett's skills were illuminated. Every chuckle meant to undermine her instead, set the stage for her authority. She carefully laid out facts that were hard to dismiss, weaving history, legal precedent, and undeniable logic into her statements. What was supposed to be a moment of belittlement instead turned into an opportunity for her to demonstrate mastery. The room, which had laughed with him, now shifted uneasily as her clarity pierced through assumptions. They had expected her to falter, maybe to stumble over her own words, but what they witnessed was a controlled dismantling of the very narrative that his laughter had attempted to uphold. As she spoke, Clarence Thomas's laugh grew heavier in the silence it left behind. The sound no longer carried amusement but became a marker of arrogance, something that contrasted sharply with the calm discipline in Crockett's delivery. His attempt at humor was exposed as a dismissal of substance, and that exposure lingered in the minds of those present. What had been intended as an end to her point instead became the beginning of a moment no one would forget. Crockett had not only countered his laugh, she had redefined it as a misstep. Proof of how easily those in positions of power could underestimate someone who refused to be diminished. The most shocking part was how subtle the transformation was. Crockett did not need to raise her voice or meet laughter with anger. Instead, she allowed Clarence Thomas's dismissal to become the fuel that sharpened her points and intensified her presence. In doing so, she showed that the real power in the room did not lie in a title or a laugh, but in the ability to remain steady when challenged. By the time she finished, it was clear to everyone that the dismissal had not weakened her. It had made her stronger, more visible, and undeniably in command. Would you like me to now expand Keynote 2 in the same way 700 words? Mentioning him, no headings or ending, so it flows as part of the larger narrative? What made Jasmine Crockett's response so remarkable was not only that she chose to answer Clarence Thomas's laughter, but how she chose to do it. In a room where emotions ran high and reputations were built on sharp exchanges, it would have been easy to fire back with outrage, to meet his dismissive laugh with anger. Many watching expected exactly that, a reaction that could be brushed aside as defensive or overly emotional. But instead, Crockett did the opposite. She embraced composure. Her demeanor shifted into something calm, focused, and purposeful. It was a decision that amplified her words far louder than if she had raised her voice. Clarence Thomas's laugh may have been dismissive, but it became the foundation upon which she constructed a display of control that no one in the room could ignore. As she stood there, the weight of his condescension still fresh in the air, Crockett began to outline her points with a precision that made the laughter seem misplaced. Rather than trying to embarrass him, she took the facts and arranged them with a kind of clarity that forced even those inclined to side with him to listen. Each word was deliberate, each example carefully chosen. Her command of detail showed not just that she had prepared for the discussion, but that she possessed an instinctive understanding of how to hold her ground against someone who had tried to dismiss her. Clarence Thomas, who had intended to cut her down with a moment of ridicule, was suddenly placed in the uncomfortable position of being a silent witness to her strength. Her controlled response was powerful because it didn't just counter his laughter, it undermined the very reason for it. A laugh suggests a lack of seriousness, an assumption that the person being laughed at is not worthy of full attention. Crockett dismantled that assumption piece by piece. Her tone was steady, not wavering under pressure, and the rhythm of her delivery made it clear she was not shaken. Instead, she appeared almost unbothered by the mockery, using it as an unspoken backdrop to her performance. Every sentence contrasted his levity with her seriousness, his dismissal with her undeniable competence. It became obvious to everyone present that she wasn't there to be reduced to a punchline. Clarence Thomas, who had spent decades being regarded as unchallenged in many settings, found himself confronted by someone who refused to play into the dynamic he had set. The fact that she did not retaliate emotionally made her response sting even more. If she had lashed out, it would have confirmed the narrative that his laugh was justified. By staying calm, she instead flipped at the moment, suggesting through her composure that the real lack of seriousness was not hers, but his. Those watching began to realize the strength of restraint, how discipline could be as cutting as any fiery outburst. The more she spoke, the clearer it became that Crockett was not simply defending herself. She was teaching a lesson about presence and authority. She reminded the room, without ever having to say it directly, that knowledge does not bow to mockery. Clarence Thomas's laugh, once a show of dominance, began to feel like a miscalculation, a move that underestimated the resilience of the person it was aimed at. In the silence that followed her words, the contrast between his fleeting amusement and her sustained composure was striking. The balance of respect in the room began to shift. Not because she demanded it, but because she earned it through the strength of her poise. What set her apart was the way she understood the moment. Instead of treating it as a personal attack, she treated it as an opportunity. She used his dismissal to reveal just how much she knew, how deeply she had prepared, and how unshaken she was by the attempts to belittle her. It was not just about defending her skills. It was about demonstrating them in real time. The controlled way she presented herself exposed the emptiness of laughter as a weapon. It highlighted that confidence built on knowledge always carries more weight than derision built on arrogance. By the time she had finished her response, Clarence Thomas's chuckle no longer carried the same weight it had at the start. What had once sounded powerful now seemed hollow, overshadowed by the control she maintained from beginning to end. His laughter had set the stage, but her composure had stolen the scene. What stunned everyone was not that she had spoken back, but that she had spoken back in a way no one could dismiss. The room itself seemed to change as Jasmine Crockett continued speaking, and it was that shift in atmosphere that carried the most weight. When Clarence Thomas first laughed, the reaction rippled outward, creating an undercurrent of agreement among those who saw her skills as something to dismiss. But as Crockett's response unfolded, the tone in the room began to move in the opposite direction. What had been a collective smirk was replaced by an uneasy silence, as if people were suddenly unsure of whether to keep siding with him. That silence wasn't accidental. It was the direct result of how effectively she took control of the moment. What Crockett did was more than speak facts. She rearranged the mood of the room itself. The authority she projected was subtle, but undeniable. Each time she spoke, she punctured the laughter that had filled the air only moments before. Instead of shrinking beneath it, she elevated the conversation until no one could deny her presence. Clarence Thomas, who had been the source of the laughter, now appeared increasingly out of place in the quiet that followed. His attempt to steer the atmosphere with humor had backfired, and all that remained was a stillness weighted by her command. It was in that stillness that people realized something had shifted. Her points weren't abstract. They were specific, factual, and carefully aligned with the very structures that Clarence Thomas himself had spent years navigating. There was no way to brush them aside as mere rhetoric. The room, which moments earlier had been primed to dismiss her, now leaned in to hear what she would say next. This wasn't about spectacle or confrontation. It was about the unmistakable force of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. That force turned laughter into silence, mockery into attentiveness. What made the shift even more remarkable was how she didn't rush to claim victory. Crockett spoke as though she was unconcerned with appearances, as though the silence of the room was simply the natural outcome of speaking with clarity. That quiet confidence magnified the weight of her words. Clarence Thomas, who had once held the upper hand with a simple chuckle, was now overshadowed by her ability to turn the entire dynamic on its head without ever raising her voice. His laughter, which had set the tone at first, now seemed like a faint memory and awkward interruption in what had become a defining moment for her. As she moved through her arguments, the silence took on new layers. It wasn't just quiet, it was attentive. People who had originally looked at Clarence Thomas to lead the reaction now found themselves watching her instead. This transfer of focus was powerful because it wasn't forced. She didn't demand their attention. She commanded it simply by being unwavering in her approach. The more she spoke, the more the room acknowledged that the authority in that moment didn't rest with him, it rested with her. The laughter that once seemed so sharp had dissolved completely into the background, leaving only the echo of its failure. Asterisk, it was also clear that Clarence Thomas felt the shift. While he had intended his laugh to suggest that Crockett's words weren't worth engaging, the silence that followed her response revealed the opposite. His silence became heavier than hers, as if the absence of another laugh or rebuttal exposed the misstep of underestimating her. The very dynamic of power had reversed what began, as his attempt to dominate the exchange had transformed into a moment where his silence carried a sense of defeat. Crockett's ability to move the room from laughter to stillness showed just how skilled she was at controlling not only her words, but the perception of her presence. Asterisk. What stunned those watching was how quickly the change took place. In a matter of minutes, the energy shifted from casual dismissal to profound respect. The audience had expected to see a clash between authority and defiance, but what they witnessed instead was authority being redefined right before them. Clarence Thomas's laugh, meant to frame her as lesser, became the very catalyst for her rise in that moment. And as the silence deepened, it became impossible for anyone in the room to deny that she had taken command. Asterisk. The transformation was not about spectacle or winning an argument in the traditional sense. It was about how Crockett reshaped the room itself. Where laughter had tried to create a hierarchy, her words leveled it, leaving behind an undeniable truth. Once the silence took hold, it belonged to her, not to him. Asterisk, would you like me to now expand Keynote 4 in the same detailed 700-word style? With him included, no headings or ending, so the sequence is fully complete. The lasting impression of Jasmine Crockett's exchange with Clarence Thomas wasn't built on a single fiery statement or an emotional outburst, but on the undeniable weight of what followed. After the laugh that was meant to reduce her to a passing moment, the way she carried herself lingered in the minds of everyone present. The moment became less about the sound of his dismissal and more about the quiet authority she established in response. By the end, people were no longer talking about the laugh itself, but about how completely she had shifted the narrative. The impression she left was one of permanence, the kind of memory that attaches itself to reputation and refuses to fade. Asterisk. Clarence Thomas, a man who had grown used to his position commanding automatic respect, he found himself in the unusual position of being remembered not for control but for underestimating someone. His laugh was supposed to be the final punctuation mark, a signal to others that her words weren't worth serious thought. Instead, it became the opening line of a story that painted him as careless in his judgment. Crockett's response did not just neutralize the dismissal, it turned it into an example of why underestimating others can be costly. Each person in the room walked away not with an image of him holding the upper hand, but of her refusing to be belittled. Asterisk. The lasting impact came from the way she held herself even after the moment had passed. She did not gloat, she did not demand recognition, and she did not look for applause. That restraint made the impression even stronger. Clarence Thomas had relied on a public laugh to assert authority, but Crockett showed that true authority requires no such performance. Her silence between points, her unhurried pace, and her steady confidence demonstrated a command that words alone could not capture. What people remembered was not only what she said but how she made them feel, aware that dignity could outweigh dismissal. Asterisk. As the story of the exchange began to spread beyond the room, it carried with it a message that extended far past that single encounter. Observers and participants alike spoke less about the laugh and more about her refusal to bend beneath it. The endurance of her presence overshadowed the fleeting humor he had tried to inject. Clarence Thomas, despite his standing and experience, was remembered for the laugh that opened the door for Crockett to prove she was not to be diminished. His action had sparked the very demonstration of skill that stunned everyone who witnessed it. Asterisk. The impression also endured because Crockett represented something larger in that moment. She showed that skill is not proven by matching mockery with mockery but by maintaining discipline when it matters most. That lesson became inseparable from her image. Clarence Thomas's laugh inadvertently set the stage for a lesson in how authority is earned, not asserted. Those who came into the room doubting her abilities left with an unshakable awareness that she had turned doubt into respect. The sharpest surprise was not simply that she held her own, but that she had done so in a way that quietly reshaped how others would view her going forward. Asterisk. Over time, what stood out most about the encounter was how different the two figures appeared in retrospect. Clarence Thomas's laugh was momentary, something that echoed for a second and then dissolved. Crockett's response was enduring, something that stayed in memory because of the weight it carried. The contrast was stark as laughter represented dismissal, hers represented strength. One faded as quickly as it arrived. The other became the story people retold when they spoke of that day. Asterisk. That is why the impression lasted. Crockett didn't just respond to a single moment of ridicule, she transformed it into a defining episode. Clarence Thomas had meant to reduce her, but instead, he elevated her without intending to. His attempt to laugh off her skills ensured that those skills would be recognized more clearly than ever. The room had watched her dismantle not just the assumptions about her, but the assumptions about what power looks like when tested. It was that reversal, the way his laughter became the foundation of her authority, that left everyone stunned long after the moment ended. Asterisk. Would you like me to now write the 500-word ending statements to tie together all 4 expanded keynotes as one seamless story arc? When the exchange finally settled, what remained was not the echo of Clarence Thomas's laugh, but the imprint of Jasmine Crockett's presence. The moment had begun as a dismissal, a simple gesture intended to trivialize her skills, but it concluded as something far greater, a demonstration of how power can be redefined when someone refuses to shrink in the face of ridicule. The room had witnessed not just an argument, but a transformation. In real time, Crockett turned condescension into an opportunity, and the response she crafted became a lasting reminder that knowledge, composure, and precision carry more strength than mockery ever could. What struck those who were present was how effortlessly she held the balance. She didn't need to escalate the situation with theatrics or raise her voice to compete with Clarence Thomas's laughter. Instead, she relied on steadiness, her control of detail, and her ability to remain unshaken. That choice made her presence resonate even more strongly. By maintaining discipline, she showed that ridicule is powerless when met with calm certainty. What began as an attempt to paint her as lesser ended with her standing in undeniable authority, proving that strength often reveals itself most clearly when tested by dismissal. Clarence Thomas, in turn, was left marked by the exchange in a way he had not anticipated. His laugh, meant as an assertion of dominance, became remembered as the spark that set the stage for his own underestimation. In the silence that followed Crockett's words, his attempt to belittle her seemed not only hollow but counterproductive. Where he had expected the room to side with him, he instead became the backdrop for her command. It was not just that she silenced the laughter, it was that she transformed it into evidence of his That contrast lingered, making his dismissal appear small against the magnitude of her composure. The significance of the encounter extended beyond a single moment in one room. It served as a reminder of what happens when confidence meets challenge, when preparation meets underestimation. Crockett's response was not only a defense of her own skill, but a demonstration of how resilience can dismantle assumptions. She showed that authority is not something to be given or taken away by the reactions of others. It is built and revealed through how one chooses to respond. Clarence Thomas may have held the title and the seniority, but in that moment, the impression left on those watching belonged entirely to her. What endured was the lesson in presence. Crockett's refusal to be belittled revealed that strength is not measured by how loudly one demands respect, but by how unshakably one embodies it. Clarence Thomas's laughter, meant to end the discussion, instead became a misstep that highlighted the very skills he had tried to dismiss. In the days and weeks after, people spoke less about the laugh and more about her response. The narrative had shifted completely. Where there had once been doubt, there was now respect. Where there had once been dismissal, there was now recognition. In the end, the room was left with more than silence. It was left with clarity. Jasmine Crockett had not only answered Clarence Thomas's laugh, she had surpassed it. His moment of condescension became her moment of definition, and it was that definition, forged in composure and delivered with precision, that stunned everyone and remained long after the laughter had